Now I do.
Good afternoon. It is March 24th, 2001. My name is Mark Shelstad. I'm the coordinator for digital and archive services with CSU Libraries. And I'm here today with photographer John Fielder. John, I want to thank you today for taking some time to talk about your photography career.
Thanks, Mark, for engaging me.
Could you please share some of your background, such as where you were born and your other family information you'd like to share?
I was born in 1950 in Washington, D.C. I lived there for a year and a half, at which time my dad, who worked in the department store business, was transferred to New York City, and we lived in Rye, New York for 4 years, and then Greenwich, Connecticut for another 5. And then he moved to a different company, JB Ivy Company, in 1960, and we moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, where I effectively grew up, went to high school there, and on to Duke University. And in 1972, after I graduated Duke with an accounting degree, oddly enough, after having worked my high school and college summers in Colorado because of his brother, my Uncle Fred, who was an industrialist, got me to Colorado to work as a ranch hand on a cattle ranch, and 2 summers in college prospecting for gold, silver, copper, and other precious metals around the West for CF&I Steel Corporation, Colorado Fuel and Iron, based in Pueblo. I knew where I wanted to be, so never looked back after arriving in Colorado, June 1st, 1972.
And how did you become interested in photography, and how did you get your start?
I grew up in a family of business people, like my dad and Uncle Fred and Uncle George worked for Otis Elevators, so that's why I took accounting management sciences at Duke, thought I'd be a businessman too. In fact, when I got to Colorado, eventually went to work for the old Denver Dry Goods Company in downtown Denver, then transferred to the May Company, May D&F, subsidiary of St. Louis-based May Department Stores Corporation. But of course, May Company was started in Leadville in the mid-19th century by Mr. May, and worked my way up at May D&F into senior management as a buyer of menswear and ladieswear clothing, and then ran the still existing, but in the name of Macy's, South Glen store in Littleton, Colorado, from age 29 to 31 on the corporate fast track. One with a wife, a child, and another one on the way. Decided to quit my high-paying corporate job cold turkey to turn my passion, my avocation, photography, into a new career. That was exactly 40 years ago, as we speak from today in 2021. And the reason why I chose photography as my second career is because I had incredible influences growing up as a child, from 4 years at age 10 to 14 at Camp Sequoia, a long tenured that's no longer into business summer camp in the Appalachian Mountains near Asheville, North Carolina. So amazing influences, being outdoors, camping and backpacking, and learning Indian lore and history at that age. And then the greatest influence in my life, Mrs. Dolly Hickman, my middle school science teacher, who, other than just 1 or 2 day weekend field trips from our school, Charlotte Country Day School, for 20 years, she organized 4,000 to 5,000 mile driving expeditions across North America to visit archaeological, biological, geological, paleontological sites all around North America, 5 weeks at a time, 7 young kids in a station wagon with her and another scientist, teacher, manager of wayward teenage kids. And I was lucky enough to be invited in the summers of 1963 and 64 at ages 13, 14, 15. The first summer all the way across the southern US, cracking open geodes in Texas, eventually down to Teotihuacan, Temple of the Sun, where we were allowed to dig for Olmec and Toltec artifacts and actually remove them from the country I just took a picture for a friend of mine who was telling me that she has arrowheads from the Pawnee Buttes in Colorado. And as we speak, on my left at my other monitor is the newest project I'm working on, my Weld County, Colorado book that'll be out in September 2021. And I just reciprocated with her arrowhead pictures and sent her back my Teotihuacan ceramic bases, 500 to 1,000 years old. Climbed Paracutine, the volcano that erupted in the farmer's cornfield in 1942, among other things. Back to North Carolina 5 weeks later, and then got invited, despite my bad deportment. Mrs. Hickman, when we were in New Orleans at a state park camping, me and Philip Honig, we left camp in the middle of the night looking for girls at the local restrooms. We got caught, and she threatened to fly us back to Charlotte. But despite my bad deportment, got invited back summer of '64. When we left Charlotte in August and ended up going into the Pacific Northwest and climbing Wizard Island in the middle of Crater Lake and on up into British Columbia and Banff, climbing mountains, and again visiting and learning archaeology, geology, biology in situ, and then back to Charlotte. So that was an influence that brought me into science, but also into nature and the outdoors. And then Uncle Fred's summer jobs in high school and college, hiking all around the West, prospecting for non-ferrous metals. All these things conspired to give me a relationship with nature that allowed me, once I decided to leave my first career, to start a new career as a nature photographer. But of course, then there was the photographic influence, and that was all started by my high school art teacher, Mr. Tony Birch, who taught us budding artists, painters, mostly sculptors, that it didn't matter what other people thought of the work that you did. It was about what you felt emotionally inside about your art. And that was a huge influence and led me to photography, which we can talk about at some point.
Those sound like fabulous experiences.
Unbelievable for a young person. It was like, whoever controls the universe, they figured out my destiny for me long ago.
Yeah, that's fabulous. Can you talk about some of the first camera equipment that you started out with professionally?
Well, in 1973, maybe a year and a half after I moved to Colorado, I continued to paint because of Mr. Birch, my art teacher's influence. I did Andy Warhol type, very graphic, hard-edged acrylic paintings on masonite, on canvas, just because I enjoyed seeing what was within me and creatively. And then, as I began to appreciate nature more, I discovered a photographer named Elliot Porter, Eliot Porter, who was, as it turned out, the color Ansel Adams of the 20th century. They were contemporaries, and Adams, of course, the great environmentalist, Sierra Club compatriot, and black and white photographer. And Elliot Porter from back east did a book in 1972 or 3 called "In Wildness is the Preservation of the World," the title of which comes from the Henry David Thoreau quote. And Porter, in the beginning of his career, photographed New England forest, deciduous forest in spring, summer, and fall and winter. And he published this book called "In Wildness is the Preservation of the World," which I happened to see, and I got a copy of it. And I just thought that the way that Porter saw nature was unique to anything I'd ever seen before, and unlike anything I conceived in my own mind at that point when I was just a budding photographer. And he especially coined the phrase intimate landscapes. So most of his scenes had no skies, no horizon. They were intimate inside portraits of nature, not necessarily close-ups, but just that distance from, say, 10 feet to 100 feet in his purview. And I was fascinated by that and wanted to learn more about it. And at the time, I was only renting 35 millimeter film cameras. I remember there was a place in Denver called Chromars, and they rented cameras. So I rented a Minolta SR-101, I believe it was, and picked up this stuff called, from the Simon and Garfunkel's song Kodachrome 25, which I knew was supposed to be the best film you could get back in those days, at least transparency film. And started doing trips on my own. I'd leave Denver because I was working 6 days a week in the department store business at 2 a.m. on a Saturday night and drive to the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, which is where I worked on that cattle ranch in the summer of 1967 while I was in high school. And I would tape my ankles like we did for football practice, put on some running shoes, gym shorts, t-shirt, a sweater, and run up with this rented camera and some food and water from 8,000 feet to 12,000 feet to be ready for sunrise in the alpine zone and take what I thought were extraordinary pictures with the camera and the film. And then I would come back Sunday night, go to work on Monday. And the old Denver Dry at that time had a photography department and a film processing service, and they would send Kodachrome off to wherever on the planet Kodachrome was processed because it was a proprietary process. And 5 days later, I'd get my slides back and I'd look at them. And the first iteration of that was a complete shock. Not only did they not look like Elliot Porter's photos that I was trying to copy, but they didn't even look like what I saw. So that was the beginning of the process of how you understand the relationship between what the eye sees and what is depicted either with negative film or transparency film or today digital sensors, because the two things are not the same. And that was the beginning of a basically 8-year process to learn photography, to learn about nature, that led to my quitting that first career and trying to make a living as a nature photographer.
Mm-hmm. Can you describe your approach to photography, particularly when you're out in the field? And I understand, there's a lot of science behind this in terms of being able to plan when you believe you're going to be getting an optimal shot. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know it at the time, but I realized that half a good photography is your eye for design and composition, and understanding, again, that relationship between what you see and how film and cameras actually depict it and what you do about that. And then the logistics of being at the right place at the right time. And I learned also that half a good photography is not only the logistics of planning your trip and then the photography itself, but it's, half is being at the right place at the right time. And the other is, again, your eye and how you capture all that. So as I began to realize being at the right place at the right time was critical, then began the logistics of how I would plan my trips. And in the early years, I only had time after getting an old 1975 Chevy Blazer, so I could four-wheel drive, which is all the time that I had when I was in that other career. I didn't have time to go out like I do today and did after that career, backpack or llama pack into the middle of nowhere for a week or two. So everything was off four-wheel drive roads, remotely in Colorado. But because I had limited time, 48, 36 hours, I had to plan very carefully. So yeah, I learned by reading some books and studying Elliot Porter's work and Ansel Adams too, to a certain extent, although I wanted to be a color photographer, not black and white, was that the light, determines often, the substance, the worth, the attraction to a photo, and that red, yellow, orange light that you get both during twilight, that is before the sun actually hits the landscape, when the colors up in the sky reflect on the landscape, and with longer exposures, one can record those colors. But when the sun directly hits the landscape, because of atmospheric physics, when white light from the sun penetrates the Earth's atmosphere obliquely, more atmosphere than in the middle of the day when the sun is coming in perpendicular to the 100-mile thick atmosphere, that light physics changes the color to yellow, orange, red, or red, orange, yellow, and the progression of sunrise, and the opposite at sunset, and that warm light coats the landscape and makes it very warm, which is attractive to the eye, and also shadows early in the day and late in the evening, especially when you're at right angles to the sun, create depth in the photograph. And depth is something that I began to learn about in order to attract the viewer to the photo. So yeah, everything was geared towards how do I set myself up to be photographing by 4:45 or 5 a.m. and then finishing my photography when the light got too high in the sky at 9, and then the logistics of getting from point A to point B to the next campsite between 9 a.m. and 4 p.m. and then setting up to be ready for the next phase of that kind of light from, let's say, 6 or 7 p.m. until sunset, 9 or 9:30 at solstice at the middle of the summer. And then understanding how I could photograph in the middle of the day with clouds when there wasn't direct light, which in the middle of the summer would wash out all the colors and make the contrast too great for photography, and keeping my fingers crossed that I'd have monsoonal cloudy light, if not rainy weather during the middle of the day so I could photograph them. So all of this part of the learning process, which begat not only the timing of it all, but trying to be at the right place at the right time by studying topographic maps and planning my trips. Once I left the department store business and did nature photography full time, the ability to look at 7.5-minute USGS topographic quads in intimate detail and preconceive what a place would look like, because on those maps, you know where the trees are, you know where the tundra is, you know where the rocks are based on the coloration of these topographic quad maps. And I could actually plan then where I wanted to be night 1, night 2, night 3, night 4, not only based on those things, but what direction would the sun hit the peak behind the alpine lake so that I could capture a reflection of that mountain in that lake at the right angle. So east-west trending drainages turned out to be better than north-south, because north-south would block the sun, whereas east-west would allow the sun to rise up and directly light the peaks without being blocked by a ridge. Similarly, at night, where did I want to end up being so that I had the setting sun pointing up a western-facing drainage. So all of this huge in terms of making me the most efficient I could possibly be to come home with more photos than less. And then finally, the ability, to maximize 7 days by, instead of going up one drainage and then down that drainage the next day, which is 6 miles, 7 miles, 10 miles up and 6, 7 miles down, I invented high altitude scrambling with 65 pounds of large format German Linhof camera gear, where instead of going down the drainage to get to the next one, I would scramble up and over these ridges at 12 to 13,000 feet in extreme talus class 5 scrambling conditions with the full pack to be able to drop down to the next drainage more efficiently and get to that next lake, 4 or 5 hours, 6 hours later. So lots of logistics for sure to maximize productivity.
Mm-hmm. You've mentioned Elliot Porter a couple of times as your inspiration. Are there other folks that have influenced your work?
Porter was number one for how to see. I ultimately ended up kind of classifying the view sheds that I would photograph into 3 different views. One, the big scenic landscape with flowers, rocks in the foreground, mountains in the background, sky, clouds, all reflecting in that alpine lake. The opposite of that became the close-up photograph with, in the early days, racking out the bellows of my 4x5 lenses double the distance of where I would normally be focused at infinity to be able to photograph 1-to-1 magnification close-ups, and then with close-up lenses on 35 millimeter cameras in order to photograph just that one single columbine flower. And then what Porter taught me was the in-between the big view and the microcosmic view, that intimate landscape where it didn't have a horizon, but it had depth, like I said, from 2 feet to 6 feet or 10 feet to 100 feet. So I got that from Porter, and just the sensitivity of the way that he saw colors in nature. From Adams, I got the environmentalism, and as my career progressed and I became a spokesperson, public speaker, and ultimately environmentalist. Adams was my inspiration there. The other photographer that inspired me was David Munch. He was kind of the first of the contemporary photographers that followed Porter and Adams in the 70s and the 80s. And he attracted me because he did lots of books like I ultimately did of different states around the US. And there was a publishing company based in Portland, Oregon called Graphic Arts Center Publishing that was his primary publisher. And Munch actually did a couple of coffee table books about Colorado before I started doing mine in the 80s. And he was a great manipulator of the 4x5. He taught me how to do extreme depth of focus photos with a 75 millimeter lens, which is equivalent to 20 or so 22 millimeter on a 35 millimeter camera in terms of angle of view, how to get really close by tilting the lens and rising the lens on the front standard, which are mechanical methods of using a large format view camera that only up till then architectural photographers would do to correct perspective, parallax distortion, and the like. And Munch was the first to really use that in an extreme way to be able to make those Columbine wildflowers look 10 times bigger than they really looked in relation to the background, the mountains in the background. And those perspective controls I learned, remotely. I didn't actually know him at the time from him, which gave me more compositional latitude when I started using the 4x5 view camera.
Yeah, great. Can you talk a little bit some of your favorite spots to shoot in Colorado and how that has changed over time?
Well, if you asked me that 40 years ago, my answer would be a little different. Today, after 40 years of pretty much photographing every square inch of Colorado's 66 million acres, and learning that even when I go back to a place for the 10th time, that it's never the same because of light and weather. And getting better over 40 years at being able to make good images from any place under any condition of light, just because practice makes perfect, like it does in any endeavor. And then doing now for the first time my first book about Eastern Colorado, Weld County, subtitled 4,000 Square Miles of Grandeur, Greatness, and Yesterdays, that any place on earth is extraordinary, and no place really is better from both a scientific standpoint in terms of ecological values and artistic values, how pretty in a more superficial sense, the way that people judge pretty pictures versus just the substance based on what it was like to be there, the ecological substance, and all these things that are really much more important to me today than just the pretty picture. That no place is any better than any other one. No wilderness in Colorado out of Colorado's 44 wildernesses are better than any others. Or in my last book that I just did, Colorado's Highest, the history of naming the 14,000 foot peaks in Colorado, that no 14er is better than any other. But with that said, as my career evolved over 40 years, traveling not just Colorado, but around the American West and then around the world, that, I've got some favorite places, mostly because they're the hardest ones to get to. I like it when there's less people than more, when I'm alone now in a given place all to myself to concentrate and enjoy its sensuousness. That where I live today, I'm looking out the window here at the Gore Range, the Eagle's Nest Wilderness, the east side of which never really got any trails because the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s didn't make it up into most of those drainages right over there. And then the Needle Mountains, that's the north-south trending mountain range, just like the Gore Range above the Durango Silverton narrow gauge between Durango and Silverton above the Animas River. The Needle's probably the most remote place in Colorado. And both of these places have more lakes, more paternoster, lake after lake after lake, stair-stepped off the glaciated cirques or drainages, which is what I love most because I love photographing reflections of mountain peaks. And they're north-south trending. That means the sun rises and sets looking up into those drainages so I can be more productive in those two mountain ranges. So the Gore Range and the needles of the San Juans, are probably my two most favorite places for all those reasons. But it's all good. Wherever I go today, I come back with 15, 20 times more good, whatever that means, photos than I did 30 years ago when I just didn't have the skills that I have today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can you talk about the changes in photography equipment and processing that you've seen over your career?
In the 1970s, if you wanted to be a top landscape nature photographer and you wanted the detail in your images to be able to make large prints, which I knew would be part of the way that I would pay for this habit, you had to use transparency film for the most part, Fujichrome 50 or 100, but that was preceded by Ektachrome 64 and Ektachrome 100, but Fuji, frankly, was better for color saturation. And you had to put those into sheet film holders, 4x5-inch sheet film holders, just like Ansel Adams used and Elliott Porter used in the first half of the 20th century. And then stick it all into what's called a view camera. But for extreme backpacking, I had to have field cameras, which were view cameras that weren't made out of cherry wood on a monorail. I had to have a field camera made out of metal so it wouldn't bust when I dropped it in the middle of a creek or down a mountainside. So I ended up discovering first Toyo 4x5 field cameras, and then ultimately the pièce de résistance German manufactured Linhof. And ultimately that was called a Master Technica camera attached to in those days we called it Bogan. Now it's called Manfrotto, Italian-built tripod because of relatively lightweight, but lightweight is not necessarily a good thing when you want a tripod to keep a 20-second exposure with a 4x5 camera steady. So Manfrotto tripod, 7 lenses. We didn't have zoom lenses in those days, so you had to have a 75 millimeter, a 115, a 150, a 210, a 360, and a 500 to have the breadth of angle of view to do what we do today with 35 millimeter cameras. 30 sheet film holders, and then I'm out for a week at a time in the middle of nowhere. That meant 500 sheets of film, and I had to be judicious because I couldn't bracket or do different exposures like I do today of one given scene. But unfortunately, in those days, without an LCD and instant gratification, you had to be really good at your metering. So you had a 1-degree Pentax handheld digital spot meter to spot meter off a gray card into the sun on the way from the sun to get the ambient light reading, and then double check that with spot readings off reflected light in the landscape. But you had to do those readings off of green, blue, and red colors because all colors are reflective of light to different intensities. If you metered off white snow, you'd be underexposed. If you metered off dark green spruce trees, you'd be overexposed. So all these arcane things to get the right exposures and hope that when you got your film back after you got back from your trip, that things weren't too dark or too light. So all of this and what was invented by the Low Alpine brothers, they were pioneers in manufacturing alpine equipment, including Greg Lowe with his Lowe Super Trekker pack to carry video equipment. And I used it for 65 pounds of large format camera gear, all strapped to my back, climbing, like I said, from 8,000 to 13,000 feet up and over ridges with all of this gear, which is the reason why I have 2 titanium cobalt chromium knees and 1 cobalt titanium artificial hip. So that was the beginning. But I also had a medium format Pentax 6x7 film camera that used 120 size roll transparency film for my backcountry ski trips. So in that case, 60 pounds of medium format equipment, sleeping bags, tents, food, all the emergency stuff you need to get from point A to point B in the winter, for basically 25 years. That was my modus operandi. And then in 2010, coincidentally, when I started having joints replaced with artificial joints, digital got good. And that began with Canon Rebel digital 5 megapixel cameras, and that led ultimately as the technology evolved to today 50 megapixel Canon 5 DSR cameras, which is what I use.
Okay. Yeah. I've often felt that Fuji was underappreciated in terms of some of its processing than some of the other films. So I was very interested to hear that comment from you about their transparency.
Yeah, the Ektachrome film was good film, but when you did long exposures, the film would you'd have to put filters because the film in long exposures would turn either green or magenta. So you had to put green and magenta filters on your camera for exposures longer than 10 seconds because of that color shift. Fuji didn't do that. And the Fuji actually was maybe 5% oversaturated, which is always tempting to a nature photographer. So you didn't have that color shift, and that's why we ended up using the Fuji once Fuji Corporation started doing its thing in the late 70s.
Yeah, yeah. Can you tell me how you've managed the business side of your photography, and what has been the most challenging in that sense?
I can't tell you how many business people I've talked to over the years. The latest last week, my optometrist in Briscoe, Colorado, who's a pretty good businessman, and he pretty much owns the optometry business in Summit County. And we were just talking when he was in the chair measuring my eye power about how I couldn't have done what I've done today to make a good living, to have money in the bank at age 70, and to be able to feed that family all those years when I was gone and the wife was raising the 3 kids, and to be able to live in Greenwood Village and to put the kids through good colleges, required money. But nature photography is probably the least easy way that anybody knows to make a good living and make a good income. But again, like I was with my exposure to nature by all those people and sources, my business background was felicitous. Thinking I'd be a businessman for the rest of my life, getting the accounting degree from Duke, then being in the department store business and learning merchandising, how to sell for 7 years, being in the beginning set out on that floor just to be basically a stock boy under the guise of executive trainee, and talking to customers and learning how you made physically a department attractive to people so that they'd buy impulsively with, towel walls in the home department and Izod Lacoste alligator shirts in the men's department. I learned item merchandising where you had 40 different colors of those items, and that would attract the fly to the ointment, the butterfly to the flower. So you'd sell more than less. And guess what? Those color theories ended up being exactly what I ended up employing in my photos, learning that color contrast, reds against greens and yellows against blue, made a photograph particularly attractive. So how, again, felicitous is that what I did as an executive trainee in the department store business made me a better photographer artistically. But the business side, for sure, knowing how to run the books, because when I quit that high-paying job, I borrowed $15,000 from my dad, found a printer in Denver, made a deal, published my first calendar, 1982. This year, 2021, the 2022 calendars will be the 41st year for my Colorado wall calendars. And that wouldn't have been possible if I hadn't printed those first 10,000 calendars in 1981 and then hoofed it myself to 120 retailers, bookstores, and gift shops around the state, and had all these calendars printed in my garage in Denver, and sold all those calendars to everybody except one bookstore in Aspen that was kind of snooty back in the day that shall go unnamed, but they became a customer ultimately, and selling all 10,000 calendars by November 1st, 1982, and then contacting my printer in Denver and saying, hey, you better print 5,000 more calendars, but not knowing the business well enough to know that you sell most of your calendars between November 1st and December. So the moral of that story is I ended up with 4,500 leftovers for Christmas gifts for friends and relatives. It wiped out my profit, but I learned the first of many business lessons about how many to print, and when I would sell my products. So my accounting degree allowed me ultimately to attract a venture capitalist who in year 2 bought half my publishing company, Westcliff Publishers, it was called, put money into the business. That allowed me to contact a Japanese printer, and I could print my first coffee table book, Colorado's Hidden Valleys, because now I had money from my investor. But then I had to get bank loans because you would collect all your receivables from your bookstores not until January, but I had to pay my printers in September. So how did you bridge that gap? Well, you had to borrow $1 million from the bank. How did you get the bank to lend you $1 million? Well, you had to do pro forma spreadsheets with what your sales were going to be, and balance sheets and cash flow statements and profit and loss pro formas. So I designed, in the old days when Lotus was the only spreadsheet software, a 600 row long by X number of columns wide spreadsheet where everything is linked. So one more calendar or one more book sold would go through 600 rows and down to the bottom line of my profit and loss statement. And the bank was so impressed with this that they wanted to use that spreadsheet for all their other customers and clients to do the same pro formas. So all of this skill from my accounting degree, from my business career as a merchant, turned out to be felicitous to be able to make a living out of both photography and publishing, which was the main way in the beginning that I made income to support my family.
Yeah, that's great. I think it's something that folks don't realize on how much time can be spent on doing these kinds of things in terms of promotion. And how did you get involved with publishing your books? I mean, you had an early publisher yourself publishing these things, but now you've published more than 40 of them. How have you felt about the ones that you are the most proudest of?
Well, I didn't start out wanting to self-publish, but in that first year, 1981, I contacted a bunch of publishers, all of which were mostly national publishers based in New York, and none of them wanted anything to do with an unknown photographer. And photography itself wasn't a huge genre, nature photography, except with Sierra Club. They would publish their own books, and there were other publishers like Norton and Rizzoli who were in the business of doing picture books. But again, I was unknown. So that's when I started thinking, okay, what does it take to publish a book? And I did my due diligence and, contacted printers and editors and graphic designers and proofreaders and all the people that go into helping you get a book to be in print. And I learned all of that just by picking people's brains, and started Westcliff Publishers. And I was able to do it myself and hired sales reps after I hoofed it that first year myself to all those stores, so that while I'm trying to raise a family with a wife and 3 kids, I got other people working for me rather than me trying to do everything myself and be Colorado's primary photographer. So there just wasn't, time in the day to do all of those functions. So you had to delegate, and that's why I ended up self-publishing. And today, yeah, it's well over 50 books, but I published 400 books for other photographers and writers, because that's how I was able to grow Westcliff Publishers into an entity that could feed the family. And we would publish 20 to 25 books a year in our heyday, in calendars of 35 states like mine about Colorado, using other great nature photographers from around the country. And then in 2006, with kids out of the house, and my wife had passed away the year before from early Alzheimer's, and I moved to Summit County. I sold that publishing company, which ultimately I had to buy back because they weren't good business people. When I moved to Summit, I started John Fielder Publishing, where I would just do 1 book and 2 calendars every year to kind of slow down and smell the wild roses up here, so to speak. So yeah, there's been a long history, over 50 books. I love each of them. But I definitely have some favorites if you want that to be the segue.
Yeah, I would please. Thank you.
So, mountains, as I discovered, my favorite ecosystem on the planet, no matter where I went around the world or in Colorado, became the alpine zone and a mountain range. And in my travels, that was always where I would go, whether it was the Pyrenees, the Picos de Europa mountains in northern Spain, or the South Island of New Zealand, or the Alps in Europe, or Alaska. So that is my home away from home, is being at an alpine lake above tree line in a mountain range somewhere, with infinite views, 360 degrees, and nobody else around me. So my first really favorite book, I mean, there are lots of books about that sort of thing because that was my focal point. But I did a book about Rocky Mountain National Park, published it in 1996 or 7. The Park Service gave me a permit to photograph the entire 300 square miles of Rocky Mountain National Park. I was the first person that was ever granted permission to go and camp wherever he wanted to camp, which effectively was next to each of 115 alpine and subalpine mountain lakes, which was off limits because Rocky Mountain was de facto wilderness, and then Senator Mark Udall got 90% of it off Trail Ridge Road, made into legal wilderness. That's part of the park rules. You can't backpack and camp except in designated sites, most of which are below tree line. But I was allowed to do the opposite, and I gave the Park Service 1,000 copies from the camera of 4x5 transparencies to use as a scientific visual record of the ecosystem in the park as of 1994 when the project was over. So that book is out of print, but it is every place that nobody gets to go, or at least camp. It's only day trips for these places in Rocky Mountain National Park, every lake in the park. And then in 2002, I published a book called Mountain Ranges of Colorado, which was effectively all 28, yes, 28 mountain ranges, like the San Juans are actually 6 mountain ranges all rolled into one. And not only that, but the most remote parts, the most remote lakes, because I backpacked up every single drainage to those high lakes and in all of these mountain ranges, effectively covering every square inch of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. So that book, along with stories that I wrote about getting from point A to point B and about the sensuousness of being in those places and photographing them, is an all-time favorite. And then a book I did later in my career, 3 years ago, Colorado Black on White, an underappreciated book, because what I did for that book was, even though I didn't photograph from the get-go in black and white, never did, except for the last of the great books that are in my inventory, Colorado 1870 to 2000, Colorado's best-selling book series of all time, in which I did repeat photography of 19th century William Henry Jackson's black and white photography of Colorado. Well, I had to copy him, so I had to use black and white negative film. But for the Colorado Black on White artistic book in 2018, I digitally turned 230 color photographs into black and white and published that book with, again, a lot of great stories about life on the trail. And it wasn't a great seller, not because it wasn't a beautiful book artistically, but because people, when they think of Colorado, they think of color, and that's what they want. But the black on white book, I think, is one of the top 5 books I've ever done. But finally, to answer your question, Colorado 1870 to 2000, that project that was spawned by my Rocky Mountain Park project when I was signing Rocky Mountain National Park books, which included in the front of the book the black and white early 20th century photography of Enos Mills, the de facto father of Rocky Mountain National Park from Estes Park. People wanted to know, hey, did you stand where Enos stood to make his photo all over again? I said, no, what a dumb idea. Why would a creative photographer want to stand where somebody else stood and take the same photo all over again? But as it turned out, when I was thinking of what to do for the millennial year, 1999 to 2000, which I knew would be a good marketing hook, what to do? Another good, pretty picture book? Or would it be interesting to people if I stood where somebody else stood, if such a person existed 100 years before, and take their photo all over again to show people how Colorado had changed a lot, a little, for the better, for the worse. Would that be interesting? So I took a guess, yes, and that was the genesis of the project that I did in partnership with the Colorado Historical Society, Today History Colorado, Channel 4, and the Rocky Mountain News, the latter two of which did so much publicity in 1999 that by the time the book and then two more from the project later on was published August 1st, 1999, Colorado Day, I had hundreds of people lined up at book signings. We were selling 10,000 copies a week, and it became the best-selling books in Colorado's history.
Yeah, yeah, that's a fabulous story. Do you think you could do that today with other projects and doing that repeats?
I have. For the last year's book, Colorado's Highest, about the naming of the 14ers, I included some of those borrowed from that project, images of the 14ers that Jackson and both I had done. But then for new repeat photography, I did that for the Weld County project. Over the last 4 years, I worked with the Greeley Museum, which is the history museum in Weld County that has a photographic archive just like History Colorado and Denver Public Library Western History Division. And I went out and found several of these old agrarian towns, which because of Dust Bowl and Depression in the 30s, are just skeletons today, if at all, are they there. And did repeat photos, of old photos when they were in their heyday and photos of what they look like today. I did the same thing of the University of Northern Colorado, which used to be the Colorado State Teachers College back in the day, of Guggenheim Hall and Gunter Hall, which is their nursing and science hall at UNC. So yeah, it's always fun to do. And when I had Westcliff Publishers, because I always knew a good thing when I saw it, I commissioned photographers to do the exact same thing that I did in Colorado of another dozen or 15 states around the US, and they were big sellers too.
Yeah, yeah. Switching gears a little bit, can you talk about your instruction? You offer photography classes every year up in Crested Butte, and what you see your role in terms of passing on the information and knowledge that you've gained to new photographers in the field.
Well, that's part of a bigger picture and goes back to my dad, who was a great civic servant. He was a successful businessman in Charlotte, but he also ran the United Way. He was on the board of trustees of my school and raised a lot of money for that community and set a good example for his 4 kids to give back a part of what you've gained from the joy of being part of any community. And that's one reason why I never really wanted to be a nationally known photographer, that I was happy just to be here in Colorado and reap what I could sow here in this state. So one of the ways that I wanted to give back, and to be honest with you, it was fun too, would be to teach people photography, which I felt like I could do well because I never really read books. I never went to any classes. I didn't have the time or the money to do that in my developing career, that everything was learned by the seat of my pants, trial and error, studying those first Kodachrome slides, trying to figure out why they didn't look like Porter's, why they didn't even look like what I saw, was a better, more organic way to learn the craft of photography than listening to somebody else or reading a book. And so when I was first invited by the Autumn Eye photography workshop run by a guy named Bill Elzey, down in Telluride to teach in 1982, was a little bit nerve-wracking because I'd never taught before. But again, because I got both a functional left and right side of the brain, an accounting degree, I was able to be analytical, and think about what did it actually take to make a good image, as well as the artistic side. So, the left side of my brain actually was a handicap. It made me more symmetrical when I was using the right side of my brain, trying to be creative, and I had to fight that and learn how to be asymmetrical and use artistic tension. So there was this dichotomy, between the two brains. That was a huge challenge for me, but it did give me the skill to be able to analyze and to be able to share with people, both verbally and then by example with my photos, how to make a better photo. So yeah, that became part of my culture, my life, and my living was teaching photography workshops, not only in Crested Butte, but Telluride and Steamboat and up here in Summit County and around the world. When I had time, I'd take a group of people to New Zealand or Alaska, and teach photography, or Utah, and teach photography there. So, and that, it's a two-way street. Teaching, as you probably know, as an academician, helps you learn your craft better by expressing yourself, analyzing your craft. You do your craft better. So I gained not only monetarily, but creatively from that. And I was giving back to people, sharing what I had learned, and I didn't covet, my position in Colorado. I wasn't worried about somebody stealing my thunder and compromising my business.
Yeah, thank you. I know many folks have been really appreciative of being able to work with you directly on those workshops.
Thank you.
Can you talk about how your career as a photographer influenced your work to protect Colorado open spaces and wildlands?
Great question. I grew up in a conservative Republican family, but of course, Republican conservatives were different in the 60s and 70s than they are today because it was bipartisan in those days. Most of our great laws that protect the environment in our country were signed into law by Richard Nixon, by bipartisan, sometimes Republican, conservative-run Congresses, because everybody back in those days, was a Teddy Roosevelt kind of a person for the most part, where whether conservative or progressive or liberal, whether Republican or Democrat, you realize the value of protecting what's left of biodiversity on Earth, whether for commercial reasons, like tourism and recreation. And Colorado is our, one of our biggest industries, $72 billion a year and over 500,000 jobs from keeping things looking nice. Same thing around the West and around the country. Just makes sense, to protect nature, and people realize that. But because politics is more polarized today and you got more extremism and, in at least both the parties, nature gets left out of the formula sometimes. So anyway, when you get to see, as I progressively did from the beginning of my career to today, so many beautiful places under so many extraordinary conditions of light, it's kind of like religion. You can't help but be fascinated, influenced, overwhelmed with what the miracle, if you will, if you want to bridge those two gaps between spiritual and scientific, the miracle of 4.3 billion years of the evolution of life, how special that is, from just practical standpoints, pretty pictures, but how lucky we are to be sentient beings, Homo sapien, 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 eyes, whatever, which sometimes is hard to appreciate when you're just trying to feed your family. But if you're in a position like I am to be relatively secure, so I can look at the big picture and understand how lucky we are to be alive on a planet, in a solar system, in a galaxy, in a universe, in what is probably an infinite multiverse, you can't help but amplify your appreciation for all things wild and natural and make better pictures as a result. So yeah, about 1993, when then Senator from Colorado, Tim Wirth, invited me to publicly speak for the first time in my life, he had commissioned me on my own volition for 18 months to photograph 750,000 acre prospective wilderness that he ultimately got passed in the 1993 Colorado Wilderness Act and added to the Colorado wilderness system. He wanted photos. He knew that Congress would respond to photos more than they would to boundaries on maps. So I gave him the photos. We published a little book called Our Wilderness Future, and he gave that to all the members of the House and the Senate. And sure enough, in 1993, they handily passed the Colorado Wilderness Act. So I was part of the protection with the highest form of land protection on the planet, the Wilderness Act, the preservation of those places, and I was inspired by that. And then that fall, Tim asked me to speak at the Colorado or DU Law School, which used to be out in Northeast Denver, where the Johnson and Wales University is now. And for the first time in my life, I had to say something and show pretty pictures with a slide projector to 500 people. And that was the beginning of realizing how much, which I already knew from Adams's influence, pictures could influence people to want to protect what's left of biodiversity on Earth, but how much personally I could do that with my voice and with my photos. And that began a career, not only of photography, but of half the time talking the gospel according to Mother Nature, with slideshows, with books, with letters to the editor, with every kind of communication known to mankind, to get the word out that not only is it fun to be in nature, but if we don't protect nature, we humans are goners.
Thank you, John. Is there anything else you'd like to add today about your career or your environmental work?
No, I just looked at our list. And Mark, you've covered all the bases, and I think that's a good summary of the holism of being trying to be a useful human and nature photographer, not just the selfishness of, how lucky it is to be able to go out and be in wilderness during a pandemic, and when people are suffering right and left on the Front Range and having to deal with the density of population and the inconvenience of trying to get a COVID shot, and gone to the grocery store and not knowing whether something awful like just happened in Boulder, Colorado. We're speaking right after that tragedy is going to happen. And here I am sitting up here looking out the window in Summit County, where my ashes will probably end up being, hopefully later, not sooner, and being able for the last year to be able to go out and do what I always do and be away from infection and publish a couple of books during that time, which is in one sense a selfish thing, but it's what I do, and it's the platform from which I think I can help people most with all those afflictions and all those challenges, is show people just how lucky we are to be alive, to have the opportunity, like so many people have taken advantage of over the last 13 months, to go out of doors and be outdoors, and to realize what medicine, as Enos Mills called it back in the early 20th century, being in a national park is, for all the challenges we have in life. And I feel so lucky to be able to continue communicating that. So thanks a lot for listening to me today, Mark.
Thank you, John.